Snoop Dogg followed an employee home after discovering her desperate plea for food on the company forum. What he uncovered in her apartment will shock you and change everything you thought you knew about corporate care. Like, subscribe, and comment below to share your thoughts on how this story could inspire real change in workplaces across the globe. The October wind whistled through the Dreamwave Records parking lot as Snoop stepped out from his late-night studio session. The facility was still buzzing with activity. He paused, watching employees stream through the entrance, each face telling its own story. "Yo, Snoop!" a young security guard called out, his badge reading Michael. "How's the new baby sleeping?" "Homie," Snoop asked, recalling their chat from last week. Michael's tired smile said it all. 3 hours at a time. Man, but worth every minute. These evening interactions had become crucial for Snoop. After years of being seen as the laid-back rapper, he'd made a conscious effort to connect with his people. Not for PR. The press wasn't around for these late-night chats, but because something had been nagging at him. Inside his office, his assistant, Rachel, was waiting with his schedule. "The board wants to discuss the new album drops," she began. But Snoop held up his hand. "Before that, show me the employee satisfaction reports from last month," he said. Rachel blinked. "The summary or the raw data?" "Raw data. All of it." She pulled up the files on his massive screen. "Any particular reason?" Snoop leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the numbers. "Something feels off. Can't put my finger on it." The night melted into morning as meetings blurred together. Album track selections, tour logistics, merchandising deals. The usual symphony of running a music empire. But between sessions, Snoop found himself watching his employees through the glass walls of his office. "Yo!" Snoop, his head of HR, David Patterson, caught his attention during a break. "Everything cool?" "You seem distracted." Snoop gestured to the bustling cafeteria below. "How well do we really know them, our employees?" "We run surveys, performance reviews." "No," Snoop cut in. "I mean really know them? What their lives are like when they clock out." David adjusted his tie uncomfortably. "With respect, Snoop, that's not typically within our purview." "Maybe it should be." Snoop turned from the window. "Implement a new communication system. I want to monitor employee forums, messages, internal communications." "Snoop, that could be seen as invasive," David protested. "Not to spy, to understand. Set up alerts for keywords related to well-being, hardship, anything that might indicate someone needs help. And I want direct access to the feed. That's unusual for a CEO of your level 2. When have I ever cared about being usual?" The system went live that night. As Snoop sat through the board meeting, his phone quietly collected data, learning patterns, analyzing conversations. Most messages were mundane, complaints about the coffee machine, discussions about project deadlines, or jokes about his latest tracks. His phone buzzed. Initially, he ignored it, focused on reviewing lyrics for a new track. It buzzed again and again. "Man, for heaven's sake," he muttered, finally picking it up. The new monitoring system had flagged something. Multiple alerts, all centered on a single message in the employee forum. "Does anyone have any leftover food from the cafe? I can work an extra hour in exchange." The timestamp showed it had been posted just moments ago by an employee named Lydia Martinez. Something about the message made him pause, the desperation carefully hidden behind professional language. The offer to trade time for food. "Computer, pull up employee file Lydia Martinez." His screen filled with information. "Engineering department. Level 3 clearance. Hired 18 months ago. Perfect attendance record. Multiple commendations from supervisors." Then he saw her time logs. "This can't be right," he muttered, scrolling through the data. "Rachel," he called out, knowing his assistant was still at her desk. She appeared in the doorway. "Yes, Snoop? These time logs for Lydia Martinez, are they accurate?" Rachel checked her tablet. "Yes, Snoop. She's been working double shifts for looks like just over 3 months now. Double shifts every day according to the logs." "Yes." "Say ida, M. To Danzelepe, M." With minimal breaks. Snoop leaned back, his mind racing. Pull up her project assignments. More screens of data appeared. Lydia's work was exceptional. Innovative solutions to complex engineering problems, consistently ahead of schedule despite the complexity. Her pay rate was standard for her level. Snoop? She was due for a raise review last month, but didn't attend the meeting. Her supervisor noted she asked to postpone it. Snoop frowned. An engineer working 16-hour days, producing exceptional work, asking for food in exchange for even more hours, and she'd passed up a chance for a raise. Show me the security feeds for her workstation. The cameras revealed a young woman hunched over her computer, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Even through the grainy footage, her exhaustion was evident. As he watched, she rubbed her eyes, checked her phone, then quickly got back to work.
Snoop?
Rachel's voice was hesitant. Should I forward this to HR? Snoop kept watching the screen. Lydia had just picked up her empty coffee cup, stared into it sadly, then set it back down. No, he said finally. This one's different. This one I need to understand myself. He pulled up the employee forum again. No one had responded to Lydia's message yet. The night shift crew was smaller. Most of the cafeteria staff long gone. His cursor blinked in the reply box. He could respond himself. Order food delivered to her desk, but something told him this wasn't about a single meal. Rachel? What's her current location? A few keystrokes brought up a map of the building. Section E. Workstation 247. She's been there since her second shift started at 7 p.m. Snoop stood up, straightening his jacket. Cancel my morning meetings tomorrow? All of them. He headed for the door, then paused. And Rachel? Pull up everything you can find about Lydia Martinez, not just her employee file, social media, public records, everything. Of course. Snoop, but what exactly are we looking for? Snoop watched the security feed one more time. Lydia had pulled a small photo from her desk drawer, looked at it for a long moment, then quickly put it away as a supervisor walked past. The truth, he said simply. We're looking for the truth. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Lydia in the forum. Never mind about the food. I'm fine. Sorry to bother everyone. The message only strengthened his resolve. Something was very wrong, and he was going to find out what. Rachel, he called after him. What are you going to do? Snoop checked his watch. First, I'm going to wait. Then I'm going to follow her home. Is that wise? He thought about the mysterious photo, the doubled shifts, the desperate message about food. Probably not, but it's necessary. As he settled back into his chair to wait, his mind raced with possibilities. In all his years running Dreamwave Records, through all the challenges and triumphs, something about this situation felt different. Perhaps it was the way Lydia had withdrawn her request, the quiet dignity in her attempt to hide her need. Or maybe it was the nagging sense that she represented something larger, a blind spot in his vision of a revolutionary label. The next few hours crawled by. Snoop busied himself with work, but his eyes kept drifting to the security feed showing Lydia's workstation. She barely moved, totally focused on her tasks despite what must have been gnawing hunger. His phone lit up with the information Rachel had gathered. He began reading, and with each detail, the mystery deepened. Lydia's social media presence had virtually disappeared 3 months ago, the exact time her double shifts began. Her public records showed a recent change of address from a decent apartment complex to a much less desirable area in South Side. And most intriguingly, there were regular payments to a medical facility he didn't recognize, New Horizon Medical Center. The pieces were there, but didn't quite fit together. Not yet. Finally, movement on the security feed caught his attention. Lydia was packing up her workstation, carefully organizing her papers and powering down her computer. Even after a 16-hour day, she took the time to leave everything in perfect order. Snoop stood, grabbing his coat. Dave, he spoke into his phone, bring the car around. And Dave, let's keep this between us. As he walked through the nearly empty building toward the parking lot, he felt the weight of what he was about to do. Following an employee home wasn't just unusual, it was potentially inappropriate, maybe even illegal. But as he watched Lydia's exhausted figure push through the exit doors ahead of him, he knew he had to understand. The final piece of information from Rachel's research flashed in his mind. Lydia had recently filed for medical bankruptcy the same week her double shifts began. Sometimes, he muttered to himself as he slipped into his waiting car, you have to break the rules to fix the system. He had no idea just how true those words would prove to be. Dave, his longtime driver, didn't ask questions when Snoop instructed him to maintain a discreet distance from Lydia's fading blue Toyota. That's why Snoop had chosen him for tonight. Dave understood the value of silence. As they followed Lydia's car through the dimming streets of Longview, Snoop's phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. Found something else. Lydia's mother's name is Isabel Martinez. Was a nurse for 30 years at Valley Medical. Retired last year due to health issues. That's all I could find. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed made his chest tight. He watched as Lydia's car signaled right, turning into a gas station. Through the windshield, he could see her counting out coins at the pump. Pull over here, Snoop instructed Dave. Keep the engine running. They watched as Lydia managed to put just enough gas in her tank to presumably get home. When she went into the station to pay, Snoop noticed she lingered by the food aisle, staring at the sandwiches before walking away empty-handed. Yo, Dave. Snoop spoke for the first time, watching through the rearview mirror. I know it's not my place, but I've seen that look before. My sister had it years ago when she was choosing between feeding her kids and paying the electric bill. Snoop leaned forward. What happened to your sister? Dave's eyes met his in the mirror. Someone helped her, changed her life. That's why I've been driving for you for 7 years. Snoop? Because I believe you're the kind of person who helps when you see something wrong. Before Snoop could respond, Lydia's car pulled out of the gas station. They resumed their careful pursuit through streets that grew progressively darker and less maintained. Every few blocks, another streetlight was burnt out, creating pools of shadow. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Rachel. Medical facility payments traced to Innovative Care Solutions. They specialize in experimental cancer treatments. Most insurance companies won't cover their procedures. Snoop's fist clenched. He knew about places like that. Cutting-edge treatments that could save lives but were deemed too experimental by insurance companies. He'd actually considered buying one such facility last year, but his board had talked him out of it, citing liability concerns. Lydia's car finally turned into a parking lot of what had once been an apartment complex, but now looked more like a last resort. The sign reading Moonlight Apartments hung crooked, missing several letters. Dave, wait here, Snoop said, opening his door. Snoop, Dave called after him. Be careful. This neighborhood. But Snoop was already walking toward the building, following Lydia's distant figure up the exterior stairs. She moved slowly now, each step looking like it took tremendous effort. He waited until she disappeared into an apartment on the 3rd floor before approaching. Standing outside her door number 312, he could hear movement inside. A TV playing softly, the sound of running water, a cough that didn't sound quite right. For the first time since this impulse began, he hesitated. What exactly did he plan to do? Show up unannounced almost at midnight at his employee's apartment? The potential headlines flashed through his mind. Rapper Snoop Dogg stalks worker. Dogg crosses line with late-night visit. But then he heard something else through the door. Quiet sobbing, quickly muffled. Before he could second-guess himself again, he knocked. The sounds inside immediately ceased. Footsteps approached cautiously. Who is it? Lydia's voice, trying to sound stronger than she clearly felt. Snoop cleared his throat. Lydia, it's Snoop Dogg. I need to speak with you. A long pause followed. He could practically feel the panic radiating through the door. Snoop? Is something wrong with my work? The propulsion calculations? No, nothing's wrong with your work. I just want to talk. Please. More silence. Then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just enough to reveal Lydia's face, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. I don't understand, she said softly. How are you here? Why? Before she could finish, a weak voice called from inside the apartment. Mia? Who is it? Lydia's face paled. It's nothing. Mama? Just a neighbor. But the voice came again, stronger this time. That's not a neighbor's voice. I know that voice from the TV. Snoop watched as Lydia closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was resignation mixed with something else. Pride? Maybe. Or determination. "Would you like to come in, Snoop?" she asked formally, as if this was a scheduled meeting in a Dreamwave Records conference room rather than a midnight encounter at her apartment. As she opened the door fully, the reality of what Dave's sister must have faced, what countless others faced, hit Snoop with physical force. The apartment was meticulously clean but desperately sparse. A hospital bed dominated the small living room, medical equipment crowding around it. And in that bed, Mama Lydia said quietly, "This is my boss, Snoop Dogg." Isabel Martinez looked nothing like her medical ID photo from Valley Medical. The woman in that picture had been robust, smiling, full of life. The person propped up against the pillows was a shadow, her cheeks hollow, her hair gone. But her eyes, they were sharp, alert, and currently fixed on Snoop with an intensity that made him understand exactly where Lydia got her strength. "So," Isabel said, her voice surprisingly steady, "you're the man my daughter spends 16 hours a day working for." And in that moment, standing in the doorway of apartment 312, Snoop Dogg, the man who'd brought hip-hop to new heights, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt small. The conversation that followed would change not just Lydia's life, but the very fabric of how Dreamwave Records operated. But that was still to come. For now, he simply stood there, letting the reality of what he was seeing sink in, knowing that everything was about to change. "Please," Isabel said, gesturing to a worn folding chair, "sit down and tell me why you followed my daughter home." Snoop settled into the backseat of his car, the Dreamwave Records parking lot eerily quiet around him. The clock on his phone showed late into the night. Usually, he'd be reviewing new beats at this hour, not following an employee through the streets of Longview. "Keep your distance. Dave," he instructed his driver. "We don't want to spook her." Dave adjusted the rearview mirror. "Snoop, if I may, I've never seen you take this kind of personal interest in an employee before." Snoop watched Lydia's Toyota pull out onto the main road, its brake lights flickering uncertainly in the darkness. "Neither have I," he murmured. His phone buzzed with another message from Rachel, providing more details about Lydia Martinez. Her credit score dropped 200 points 3 months ago. Multiple credit card applications rejected, second mortgage on mother's house denied. The pieces were forming a picture he didn't want to see. As they followed Lydia's car through the glittering streets of Dreamwave's corporate neighborhood, Snoop found himself lost in thought. "Dave," he said suddenly, "how much do we pay our level 3 engineers?" "I wouldn't know exactly, Snoop. But you know what they drive? Don't you? You see them in the parking lot every day." Dave nodded slowly. "Most of them are in new rides. Company lease program, yet Lydia was driving a Toyota that had seen better days." Snoop leaned forward. "When was the last time you saw an engineer at her level taking public transit to work?" "Never." "Snoop, not in this area. The commute would be impossible, especially for someone working double shifts." Snoop finished. They were leaving the manicured corporate parks behind now. Lydia's car turned onto a boulevard lined with strip malls and check-cashing stores. The streetlights here were dimmer, spaced further apart. His phone lit up with a call from his head of HR. "David," Snoop answered. "It's almost midnight." "Snoop, I just got an alert about unauthorized access to employee files. Someone's been pulling detailed records on Lydia Martinez." "That would be me." A pause. "Snoop, with all due respect, there are protocols." "What's her salary?" What?" "Lydia Martinez. What do we pay her?" The sound of typing came through the phone. "Standard rate for her level. $142 Sordero annually, plus benefits. And that's good money, isn't it? David, that's what you're about to tell me." "Well, yes, for her experience level." "Then explain something to me." Snoop cut in, watching Lydia's car pull into a rundown gas station. "Why is one of our best engineers counting quarters to buy gas?" Through the windshield, he could see Lydia at the pump, carefully feeding coins into the machine, the amount display creeping up slowly. "Snoop, if an employee is having financial difficulties, there are programs. Programs that require paperwork. applications, approvals, programs that put people's private struggles on display. Snoop watched as Lydia replaced the pump, her movements heavy with exhaustion. How many of our employees actually use these programs? David? Another pause. Less than 1%. And why do you think that is? Before David could answer, Lydia's car was moving again. I have to go, Snoop said, ending the call. They were deep in the industrial district now, warehouses looming on either side, their empty windows like hollow eyes in the darkness. Lydia's Toyota turned down a side street, then another, moving into residential areas that grew progressively more worn with each block. Yo, Dave, Snoop said quietly. I know this neighborhood. My sister used to live here before. Before what? Before things got better for her. It's where people go when they're running out of options. The streets here were poorly lit, many of the homes showing signs of neglect. But something struck Snoop as they drove. Despite the poverty, there were signs of dignity everywhere, tiny gardens in cracked containers, wind chimes made from salvaged metal, people trying to create beauty in the midst of hardship. Lydia's car slowed, turning into a parking lot that had seen better days. The sign for Moonlight Apartments cast a sickly yellow glow over crumbling concrete. Stay here, Snoop instructed Dave, opening his door. Snoop, this area has people living in it who deserve better, Dave said. That's all I need to know. Snoop straightened his jacket. He watched from the shadows as Lydia gathered her things from her car, a stack of engineering drawings, a small laptop bag, what looked like a bag of medical supplies. She moved slowly now, the weight of her 16-hour day evident in every step as she climbed the exterior stairs to the third floor. Snoop could see her pause several times, leaning against the railing. His hand twitched, fighting the urge to help her carry her burden. On the third-floor landing, Lydia fumbled with her keys, dropping them with a quiet curse. When she bent to pick them up, a few papers slipped from her stack, scattering in the light breeze. One of them drifted toward Snoop. He caught it before it could blow away completely, and what he saw made his breath catch. It wasn't an engineering drawing. It was a medical bill. The amount made his eyes widen. 147.892.43. And it was marked past due, final notice. The sound of a door opening drew his attention back to the third floor. Lydia had disappeared into her apartment, leaving Snoop alone in the parking lot, holding a piece of paper that explained everything and nothing. He took the stairs slowly, his mind racing. The amount on the bill was more than Lydia's annual salary. She was already working double shifts, living in this rundown apartment, driving an old car. At apartment 312, he paused. Through the thin walls, he could hear movement inside, a television playing softly, the whir of medical equipment, a weak cough that didn't sound right. And then, very quietly, he heard Lydia's voice. I'm sorry. Mama, the cafeteria was closed by the time I could take a break, but I'll make you something now. An older voice, fragile but determined, responded. Mija, you need to eat too. I had a big lunch, Lydia lied, and Snoop felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen her message on the employee forum, begging for leftover food. Mama? Please, Lydia continued. The new treatment is working. That's all that matters. Not if it kills my daughter in the process. The older voice grew stern. I was a nurse for 30 years. I know when someone isn't eating properly. Snoop raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What right did he have to intrude on this private moment? But then he remembered something his mother had told him years ago. Sometimes, the right thing to do and the comfortable thing to do are not the same thing. He knocked. The sounds inside immediately ceased. Footsteps approached cautiously. Who is it? Lydia's voice, trying to hide her exhaustion. Snoop took a deep breath. This moment, this exact moment, would change everything. He didn't know how yet, but he could feel the weight of it. Lydia, it's Snoop Dogg. I need to speak with you. The silence that followed was deafening. He could almost hear her heart pounding through the door. Snoop? Her voice cracked slightly. Is something wrong? Did I make a mistake in the calculations? No mistakes. Lydia, I just want to talk. Another pause. then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just enough to reveal Lydia's face, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How are you here? Why?" From inside the apartment came that weak voice again. "Mija."
Guinness.
Snoop watched as Lydia's professional mask cracked just slightly. In that moment, she wasn't an engineer at one of the world's most innovative labels. She was a daughter trying desperately to save her mother's life. "It's nothing." "Mama?" she called back, but her voice betrayed her. "That voice?" the older woman said. "I know that voice from the television." Lydia closed her eyes, and Snoop could see the calculations running behind them. The same kind of problem-solving she brought to her engineering work, but this time trying to figure out how to handle an impossible situation. When she opened her eyes again, there was resignation mixed with something else, a fierce pride that refused to be diminished by circumstances. "Would you like to come in, Snoop?" she asked formally, as if this was a scheduled meeting in a conference room rather than a midnight encounter at her door. As she stepped back to let him enter, Snoop caught his first real glimpse of her apartment. The space was immaculately clean but desperately sparse. A hospital bed dominated the small living room, surrounded by medical equipment that looked out of place in the humble setting. And in that bed lay Isabel Martinez, a woman whose medical ID photo from Valley Medical had shown a vibrant nurse who had spent 30 years caring for others. The woman before him now was gaunt, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf, but her eyes, they burned with the same intelligence and determination he saw in her daughter. "So," Isabel said, her voice surprisingly strong, "you're the man my daughter works 16 hours a day for." The way she said it wasn't accusatory. "Exactly." But there was a challenge in her tone that made Snoop understand exactly where Lydia got her strength. "Mama?"
Please.
Lydia started, but Isabel held up a hand. "No, Mia. If the CEO of Dreamwave comes to our home at midnight, he must have a good reason." She fixed Snoop with a piercing gaze. "Don't you—" "Snoop?" Snoop looked around the apartment, taking in the details, the folding table covered in engineering drawings, the kitchen counter with its row of pill bottles, the single apple in a bowl, probably Lydia's entire dinner. "Yes," he said finally. "I do. But I'm beginning to think my reason for coming isn't nearly as important as what I'm seeing now." Isabel's expression softened slightly. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a worn folding chair, "and tell us why you followed my daughter home." Lydia made a small sound of surprise. "You followed me?" "I did." Snoop sat down, maintaining eye contact with Isabel, because something wasn't adding up, and I needed to understand. "And do you?" Isabel asked. Snoop pulled the medical bill from his pocket, the one that had blown toward him in the parking lot. "I'm starting to." Lydia's face paled when she saw the paper. "Snoop, I can explain." "You don't have to," he cut in gently. "Not yet. First, I want to hear about this treatment that's working." Isabel and Lydia exchanged a glance, years of shared struggles passing between them in that single look. Finally, Isabel spoke. "It's an experimental immunotherapy," she said. "The insurance companies won't cover it because they say it's unproven. But it's working. My numbers are improving." "At what cost?" Snoop asked quietly, looking at Lydia. Lydia lifted her chin. "Whatever it takes." And in that simple statement, Snoop heard everything, her determination, her exhaustion, her fear, her love. He had employees who complained about their royalties while driving their third luxury car, and here was Lydia Martinez, working herself to exhaustion, living on virtually nothing, all to keep her mother alive. The reality of it hit him like a physical blow. He'd built a label that was revolutionizing music, pushing boundaries, but somehow he'd missed something fundamental about taking care of the people making those revolutions possible. "Snoop." Lydia's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you going to report this?" "The double shifts. I mean, I know it's against company policy, but—" "No," he said firmly. "I'm not going to report it. I'm going to fix it." "Fix what?" Isabel asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. Snoop stood up, his mind racing with possibilities. "Everything." But first, he pulled out his phone. I'm ordering food. Real food, not cafeteria leftovers. And while we eat, we're going to talk about exactly what needs to change at Dreamwave.
Snoop?
You don't have to, Lydia protested. Yes, I do. He met her eyes. Because if I don't fix this, really fix it, not just for you but for everyone, then what's the point of all the innovation? What good is revolutionizing music if we're not taking care of the people creating it? Isabel smiled then, a real smile that transformed her tired face. Now that, she said, sounds like the Snoop Dogg I see on TV. As he placed the order for food, Snoop realized something. He'd come here looking for answers about one employee's situation. But instead, he'd found something much bigger, a wake-up call about what it really meant to lead a label into the future. The conversation that followed over late-night takeout would change not just Lydia's life, but the very foundation of how Dreamwave Records operated. But those changes were still to come. For now, in a small apartment in Moonlight Apartments, 3 people sat down to share a meal and begin the process of making things right. As Snoop sat in Lydia's modest apartment, the aroma of freshly delivered soul food filled the air. He couldn't help but notice how Lydia kept glancing at her mother's medical monitors, even during what should have been a moment of respite. Her vigilance never wavered. The mac and cheese is on point, Isabel said, taking small, careful bites. Though I suspect it costs more than we usually spend on groceries in a week. Mama? Lydia whispered, embarrassed. But Isabel Martinez wasn't finished. Tell me, Snoop, do you often follow your employees home in the middle of the night? No, Snoop admitted, setting down his fork. This is a first. Then why my daughter? Before he could answer, one of the medical machines beeped. Lydia was on her feet instantly, checking readings, adjusting tubes with practiced efficiency. She could have been a doctor, Isabel said softly, watching her daughter work. She had the grades, the intelligence, but medical school was too expensive, so she chose engineering instead. Ironic, isn't it? She chose a different path to avoid medical debt. And here we are anyway. Mama, please, Lydia said, returning to her seat. Snoop doesn't need to hear all this. Actually, Snoop leaned forward, I think I do. Tell me about the treatment. Mother and daughter exchanged glances. Finally, Lydia reached for a thick folder on the nearby table. It's called adaptive cell therapy, she explained, pulling out several documents. Basically, they modify the patient's own immune cells to fight the cancer. The success rates are promising. But because it's experimental, insurance won't cover it. Not a penny, Isabel confirmed. They called it elective. Experimental treatment as if choosing to live is elective. The hospital payment plan was manageable at first, Lydia continued, spreading out bills on the table. I took a second mortgage on Mama's house, used my savings, but then there were complications. Additional treatments needed, and that's when the double shifts started. Snoop guessed. Lydia, your salary goes entirely to the treatments? She nodded. The cleaning jobs pay for food and rent most days. A memory flashed in Snoop's mind. Lydia's message on the employee forum asking for leftover food. He'd thought he'd understood then. But now, the treatment is working. Though, Lydia added quickly, as if afraid he'd judge their choices. Show him your latest numbers. Mama. Isabel handed over another paper. Medical charts showing a clear downward trend in several markers. The doctor says if we can continue for another 6 months. Lydia's voice cracked slightly. 6 more months of killing yourself. Isabel cut in. No, I won't have it. Better to let nature take its course than watch my daughter destroy herself. Mama, we've talked about this. No, you've talked. I've watched. Watched you grow thinner, more exhausted, watched you skip meals, work impossible hours. This isn't living, Mia. But you're getting better. At what cost? The argument had the feel of one they'd had many times before. Snoop watched as Lydia rubbed her temples, a gesture he'd seen on the security cameras earlier that night. When was the last time you slept more than 4 hours? He asked her. Lydia blinked, caught off guard by the question. I'm not sure. Last weekend, maybe. And eaten a full meal? She looked away. I have protein bars at my desk. Had a day off? The treatments don't take days off, she said quietly. Isabel reached for her daughter's hand. Tell him about the promotion you turned down. What promotion? Snoop asked sharply. Lydia shifted uncomfortably. 3 weeks ago, team lead position, but it would have meant training sessions during my second shift hours. So you declined a better position, better pay, because it would have interfered with working yourself to death, Isabel finished. I had no choice. There are always choices. Mia, even impossible ones. Like what? Letting you die? Lydia stood abruptly, pacing the small room. Watching the cancer win because we can't afford the one treatment that's actually working? Is that the choice you want me to make? The machines beeped again, and Lydia moved automatically to check them, her movements precise despite her obvious exhaustion. Snoop, Isabel said while her daughter was distracted. Do you know what the hardest part of being a nurse was? What? Watching people choose between their health and their financial survival. Seeing families torn apart, not by disease, but by the cost of fighting it. She gestured around the apartment. I spent 30 years helping people through their worst moments, and now I'm watching my own daughter face the same impossible choices I saw destroy so many others. Lydia returned to her seat, but her hands were shaking slightly. Snoop noticed she hadn't eaten more than a few bites of her food. The doctor says her body is responding to the treatment better than anyone expected, she said, almost to herself. Just 6 more months. I can handle anything for 6 months. Can you? Snoop asked gently. Because from where I'm sitting, you're already handling more than anyone should have to. I don't have a choice, she repeated, but her voice was smaller now. Everyone has a choice, Snoop said, standing up. And it's time I made mine. Both women looked at him, confusion clear on their faces. Snoop, Lydia asked hesitantly. He pulled out his phone, checking the time. It's too late to call the board now. But first thing tomorrow morning. The board? Lydia's eyes widened. Snoop, please, if this is about the double shifts, I know it's against policy, but this isn't about policy, he cut in. This is about doing what's right. Not just for you, but for every employee who might be facing something similar. I don't understand. Snoop looked around the apartment again, at the medical equipment that meant life or death, at the stack of bills representing an impossible choice, at the mother and daughter who'd sacrificed everything to buy a few more months together. When I started Dreamwave, he said slowly, I had a vision of changing the music industry. But what good is revolutionizing music if we're not taking care of the people making it possible? He turned to Isabel. How much does the treatment cost? Total? Everything included? She named a figure that would have bought several luxury cars. Snoop nodded, making notes on his phone. And the doctor says 6 more months? That's the current estimate, Lydia confirmed. But, Snoop, why? Because tomorrow morning, I'm calling an emergency board meeting, and we're going to revolutionize something else, how we take care of our people. Snoop, Lydia stood, her professional mask slipping back into place. I appreciate the concern, but I can handle. Lydia, he cut in gently. When was the last time you let someone else handle anything? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Exactly, Isabel said softly. My daughter, always carrying the world on her shoulders. Not anymore, Snoop said firmly. Starting tomorrow, things change. Not just for you, but for every Dreamwave employee who might be one medical emergency away from impossible choices. How? Lydia asked. And for the first time that night, Snoop heard something like hope in her voice. First, we're going to take care of your mother's treatment, all of it. But the cost is less than what we spend on studio equipment in a month. He held up a hand to stop her protest. Then, we're going to revamp our entire healthcare policy. No more gaps, no more experimental treatment exclusions. If a treatment is showing results, it's covered. The board will never. The board works for me, not the other way around. His voice took on the tone that had launched careers and changed the music industry. And once we've done that, We're going to look at every other policy that might be forcing our people to choose between their families and their jobs. Isabel was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You sound angry? Snoop, I am angry, he admitted. Angry that one of my best engineers is cleaning offices on her lunch break. Angry that a woman who spent 30 years caring for others can't get the care she needs. Angry that it took following you home to see what was happening right under my nose. Lydia sank back into her chair, tears finally spilling over. I never wanted anyone to know. Never wanted to be a burden. You're not a burden, Mija, Isabel said fiercely. You're my daughter. And you've carried this alone for too long. Snoop watched as Lydia finally broke down, months of exhaustion and worry pouring out as her mother held her hand. In that moment, he made another decision. Take tomorrow off, he said quietly. Lydia's head snapped up. But my projects will still be there the next day. Take the week, actually. Paid leave. Retroactive for all the overtime you never claimed. I can't. Yes, you can. Because while you're resting, I'm going to be very busy changing things that should have been changed a long time ago. He stood, pulling out his phone to call Dave. But before he could, Isabel spoke again. Snoop, thank you for following my daughter home tonight. He looked at Lydia, who had finally fallen asleep in her chair, her hands still clasped in her mother's. No, he said softly. Thank you for showing me what I needed to see. As he left the apartment, his mind was already racing with plans. Tomorrow would bring changes, big ones. But for now, he had given something precious to a daughter and mother who had nearly lost everything: hope. Snoop arrived at Dreamwave Records headquarters before sunrise, his mind still racing from the events of the previous night. The cleaning crew looked surprised to see him. It was barely dawn. Rachel, he called out to his assistant as he strode toward his office. I need you to set up an emergency board meeting today. No exceptions. Snoop, it's not even dawn, Rachel replied, her voice groggy over the phone. Then wake them up. Conference room by 8 a.m. And get me all our current healthcare policy documents. He could hear her typing. Snoop, did something happen? Snoop paused at his office door, remembering Lydia's raw hands and Isabel's medical machines. Yes, something that should have never been allowed to happen in the first place. By 7:30 a.m., his office was a war room of spreadsheets and policy documents. David from HR hovered nervously nearby. Snoop, about the Martinez situation. How many others? Snoop interrupted. How many other employees are working double shifts? Living on the edge, choosing between healthcare and eating? David shifted uncomfortably. Our surveys don't typically... That's the problem. Isn't it? Snoop stood, gathering papers. We don't know because we don't ask. Well, that changes today. The board members filed in at 8 a.m. sharp. Their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Emergency meetings weren't unusual with Snoop, but something about this one felt different. Gentlemen, Snoop began, but then stopped. On the conference room TV, a news ticker caught his eye. Healthcare costs continue to rise. Experimental treatments remain out of reach for most Americans. He changed his approach. What's the most valuable asset Dreamwave has? Board members glanced at each other. Our intellectual property? One offered. Our market position, said another. Wrong. Snoop tossed Lydia's employee file on the table. It's our people, and we're failing them. He spent the next hour laying out everything he discovered. The impossible choices, the hidden struggles, the gaps in their supposedly comprehensive benefits. But, Snoop, one board member interjected, our healthcare package is industry standard. Industry standard isn't good enough anymore. Snoop pulled up some calculations. Do you know what we spend on studio gear annually? More than what it would cost to cover experimental treatments for every employee who needs them. The shareholders will understand that taking care of our people is the best investment we can make. His voice took on the tone that had launched hit records. And if they don't, they can find another label to invest in. The room fell silent. Snoop, the head of finance, spoke carefully. What exactly are you proposing? Snoop outlined his plan. Complete healthcare coverage, including experimental treatments, retroactive payment for overtime, mental health support, child care assistance, housing allowances for those caring for sick family members. The cost, someone started to say, is less than what we lose in productivity when our best people are stretched to the breaking point. Snoop pulled up another spreadsheet. I had our analysts run the numbers all morning. Even from a purely financial perspective, this makes sense. The discussion continued for hours. By early afternoon, faces that had started skeptical began to show understanding, even enthusiasm. At 2:00 p.m., his phone buzzed with a message from Dave, his driver. Thought you'd want to know. Dropped off groceries at the Martinez's apartment as requested. Isabel asked me to tell you Lydia finally slept for 6 hours straight. Snoop smiled, then addressed the board again. We're not just making music here. We're shaping culture. But that culture needs to work for everyone. Not just our fans, but the people making it possible. By late afternoon, the votes were in. The new policies would take effect immediately. But Snoop wasn't finished. He had one more stop to make. The sun was setting when he pulled into the Moonlight Apartments parking lot again. This time, he didn't hesitate at apartment 312. Lydia opened the door, looking more rested than he'd ever seen her. Snoop, is everything okay? Everything's better than okay. He handed her a folder. These are the new company policies. I want you to be the first to see them. As she read, her hands began to shake. This can't be real. It is. He gestured to where Isabel sat in her medical bed, looking stronger already. Your mother's treatments are fully covered, retroactive to the first day, and there's a team working on getting you both into a better apartment, closer to work. But why? Lydia whispered. Why do all this? Because sometimes, Snoop looked around the apartment, at the medical equipment that would soon be unnecessary, at the folding table where Lydia had worked herself to exhaustion, at the mother and daughter who had shown him what real strength looked like. It takes seeing something through new eyes to realize what needs to change. He pulled out one more document. There's something else. The promotion you turned down, it's still yours if you want it. Standard hours. Of course. Lydia looked at her mother, tears in her eyes. Isabel smiled. Take it. Mia. It's time to let someone else handle things for a while. 3 months later, Snoop stood at a podium addressing a room full of industry leaders and press. The headline behind him read, Dreamwave Records revolutionizes corporate health care, a new standard in employee care. He didn't mention Lydia or Isabel by name. Instead, he spoke about dignity, about how no employee should have to choose between saving a loved one and their own well-being, about how true innovation meant caring for the innovators. In the audience, Lydia sat quietly, Isabel beside her in a wheelchair but looking healthier than she had in months. They didn't need recognition. The changes happening around them were enough. Other companies were following Dreamwave's lead, healthcare policy shifting across the music industry. That evening, as Lydia drove home in her new ride, a company benefit she could finally accept, she passed the old Moonlight Apartments. The signs still hung crooked, but something was different. In the small patches of dirt around the building, someone had planted actual flowers. Sometimes, she realized, change starts small, with a desperate message about food on a company forum, and sometimes it grows into something that can transform not just one life, but thousands. At home in their new apartment, filled with sunlight and hope, Isabel was waiting with a home-cooked meal. No more hospital bed, no more mountains of bills, just a mother and daughter sharing dinner at a proper table, talking about their days like normal people. You know, Isabel said, passing the salad, I saw Snoop on TV today. Oh? He said something that reminded me of that night. About how real revolution isn't just about music. It's about humanity. Lydia smiled, remembering the desperate woman she'd been just a few months ago. He changed everything. Didn't he? Isabel reached for her daughter's hand, no longer raw from extra cleaning jobs, now strong and sure. No, Mia. You did. He just needed to see it through your eyes. And somewhere across the city, in his Dreamwave office, Snoop Dogg was already working on the next revolution. But this time, he looked at every proposal, every policy, every decision through a different lens. Would this help his people thrive, not just survive? The answer, more and more often, was yes. Disclaimer. All stories shared on this channel are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. We advocate for a world where everyone has equal rights under the law and where society continues to grow in fairness, development, and civilization. Our goal is to share heartwarming stories that contribute to making life better. Any resemblance to real events, individuals, or organizations is purely coincidental and unintentional. These stories are not meant to reference any actual people, events, or entities, and contain no political or religious connotations.